The Musketeers Apprentice will be coming out soon. In celebration, I'm posting the first 3 chapters here. I will be posting more now. I'm trying to hire people to do everything but write, so I can get a life again. And posting. And all that. These chapters are unproofed. The book, needless to say, isn't. The Musketeers Apprentice Sarah d'Almeida. The many inconveniences of a sin of vanity, flying and fighting, murder done. Monsieur Pierre du Vallon, a huge man with broad shoulders and a wealth of red hair and beard, knew that his besetting sin was vanity. Oh, he wouldn't put it that way, though his friend Aramis often put it just that way. If pressed, Monsieur du Vallon, whom the world had known for years as the Musketeer Porthos, would say that he knew himself to be a well-set man, twice as broad, twice as strong, twice as valiant as all others. Pushed further, he might admit he had a fine taste in clothes, and that his swordplay was the best ever seen. This he did not consider vanity as such, but a mere statement of facts. It only seemed to him odd that most people refused to acknowledge these truths. That this made him particularly vulnerable to the admiration of those who did know Porthos' true worth. Porthos would be the first to admit. It had been Aramis's admission that Porthos was the best fencing master in Paris, which had caused Porthos to try to teach the effete young man then known as Chevalier d'Herblay how to fence in time for an impending duel. It had, however, been Porthos' real worth as a teacher that had allowed Aramis to kill his opponent in that duel, in direct violation of the king's edict against dueling. And this in turn had forced both d'Herblay and du Vallon, his second in the duel, to go into hiding, as Aramis and Porthos in the king's musketeers. None of which, Porthos thought as he stood in the middle of the vast empty room, explained why he found himself now waiting for a student who was a good 2 hours late. The student, Guillaume Jaucourt, had approached Porthos a month ago, and had told Porthos that he knew Porthos' secret. He knew Porthos' true identity. Porthos had shrugged this off, because who would listen to a son of minor nobility, a young boy just turning 12? And besides, Porthos was fairly sure that the king and Monsieur de Treville, captain of the Musketeers, knew his identity. He was fairly sure, even, that it was an open secret in the court. It was only that, Porthos thought, as long as no one could prove it, the king didn't need to punish Porthos for du Vallon's trespass. But then the young man who had begged Porthos to teach him fencing had said that du Vallon had been universally acknowledged as the best fighter and sword master in all of Paris, which is to say in all the world. Porthos' inability to resist hearing the truth thus stated had made him agree to teach the boy to fence. And he'd done just that for weeks. The youth, a stripling promise of future manhood, had proven deft with the sword, capable of parrying and thrusting with the best of them, and with fast and deceptive enough footwork to rival Porthos' own. Not that Guillaume was ready to fight duels. He was all of 12, with dark red auburn hair, grey eyes and an intent, serious expression. He'd listened most attentively to Porthos' instructions not to duel. After all, the Musketeers didn't take boy recruits. But he'd proven a willing student, ready and capable of great work. He'd always been on time. Punctual like an Englishman. It was only today that he was late. Very late. And Porthos found himself worried against his wishes. The room where Porthos stood was in the bottom floor of the lodgings he rented. Situated at the back, it faced the garden and the back gate. It had been in the distant past when the house had been built, and when this area of Paris had still held fields and farmers, the loggia of the building, the place where harvest was brought in and fruits and vegetables stored. Vast and cool and windowless, it got all its light from the door when it was opened. Why the landlord hadn't converted it into rooms to rent, Porthos didn't know nor care. But when he'd found out that this room sat here, unused, at the back and bottom of the house, he'd made it his business to ask the landlord for the use of it. Given the Musketeer's size and girth, few men of normal size thought to say no to him. And so Porthos, and his friends Aramis, Athos and D'Artagnan, had for some time commanded the use of this room for their sword practices. Musty and smelling of long disuse and dried apples, it was nonetheless broad enough and secret enough. They could have mock duels without calling on them the wrath of the cardinal guards, with their fanatical enforcement of the prohibition on duels. And here they didn't have to listen to comments and heckling from other musketeers as they did when they practiced at Monsieur de Treville's residence. Aramis had snickered and said it was vanity that had led Porthos to line the narrow space with many mirrors. And though Porthos felt aggrieved by the accusation, he did not know how to defend himself. For there was this in Porthos, able, accomplished giant that he was, that words scared him more than any foe might whom he could meet in field of battle or duel. Words slipped through his mind, where sounds and sights and senses resounded as clearly as church bells on a silent summer afternoon. So he lacked the words to explain to Aramis the mirrors were there for 2 reasons: one, to propagate what little light came through the open door, and another, to allow him to study his movements and those of his opponents, when they practiced sword play. If it allowed him to examine the excellent cut of his doublets, the fullness of his hat plume, and the way his broad ankle-long Venetians molded his muscular legs, so much the better. But now he looked in the mirror and did not see that. Instead, above the worn linen pants and tunic, in which he dressed for the lesson, he saw a pale, intent face with dark blue eyes staring in puzzled wonder. Because Guillaume hadn't come. And this, he told himself, might not mean any more than that the boy had been stopped by a zealous father or an officious mother. From things the boy hadn't said, from hints and notions and occasional mentions of his family, Porthos understood they didn't mean for him to learn to fight. Why, Porthos couldn't hazard to guess. Who understood parents, anyway? Porthos' own father hadn't wanted his son to learn to read, being fully convinced that learning to read would soften and feminize his huge son. Porthos hadn't been able to master reading until he'd come to Paris in search of his fortune. Perhaps Guillaume's father intended the boy for the church, and perhaps he subscribed to the not particularly popular notion that churchmen should be men of peace. In which case, Porthos should introduce him to Aramis, who had once been a seminarian and who still considered himself in training for the habit, but who could wield the sword with murderous skill and intent. Still, Porthos told his very worried-looking reflection Guillaume's absence meant nothing. Absolutely nothing. Just that his family had caught him sneaking out of their lodgings. Or perhaps that the boy had changed his mind about wanting to learn sword play. Which meant Porthos should never have agreed to teach him in the first place. Or not for free. At least if he demanded money the boy might have taken the whole thing more seriously. The Porthos in the mirror ignored these rational reassurances. He bit worriedly at the corner of his lip. Porthos grumped and smoothed his mustache out of his mouth and glared at his reflection. The reflection glared right back, his eyes full of worry. Worry for what? The boy was fine. He'd missed one lesson. What was there to that? Porthos' thick fingers pulled and stroked frantically at his luxuriant red mustache. What was there to it? Only this. That the boy had been so intent, so decided, so capable of hard work, that Porthos refused to believe he would give up on his lesson so easily. And because Porthos had made sure the child understood that he wouldn't continue teaching him unless he showed for every lesson punctually, Guillaume would know that this one miss could mean the end of his apprenticeship. The Porthos in the mirror looked triumphant, justified in his worry. And Porthos stomped. God's blood. So, the boy was late. And so, perhaps something had happened to him. What was Porthos to do to that? He was not the boy's father. And on this there was a sharp feeling of something that inarticulate Porthos would never find the words to describe. He had the sudden forlorn feeling that, had life been different, had his family lands not been poor and forsaken and inhabited by peasantry, just as poor and forsaken, had his father known how to plant the land with newer, more fashionable crops, he would now be married, and have half a dozen children clustering around him. The longing for that life that had never happened surprised him. He would have liked half a dozen broad-shouldered sons, clustering around him, learning sword fighting and horseback riding from him, and admiring their father's strength and courage. He growled at the Porthos in the mirror, whose image was giving him these ideas, and, removing his hat, flung it with force to the dusty stone floor of the room. Oh, curse it all. God's death. What was he to do about this? And what did Guillaume have to do with these children that Porthos had never had and would probably never have? What he had to do, the frowning, worried reflection seemed to tell Porthos, is that Porthos had enjoyed Guillaume's company, as if Guillaume were a replacement for those sons Porthos would never have. And the boy had responded to Porthos that way too. He'd listened to him with full attention and learned to repeat his movements faultlessly. No, nothing short of a major disaster would have prevented such a determined and cunning boy from coming to his lesson. Slowly, Porthos picked up his hat and dusted its plume. The devil of it was that he had no idea at all where the boy came from. Oh, the child had told him his name, but Jaucourt was not a name that Porthos knew. It must be the name of a family recently come to Paris from the provinces, and probably renting lodgings meaner than Porthos owned from some landlord, in some part of town. What part of town, only God himself knew. That is, if he had paid any attention to such an unimportant matter. Porthos hadn't bothered to find the family home because the child was clearly coming to his lessons in secret but assiduously. As a huge sigh escaped his lips, Porthos wondered how to track someone, how to find them, and discover if a mishap had befallen them when you didn't know where they were coming from, or what their route was to get here. He walked to the door and looked down at the garden, slumbering in the early morning cool soon to turn into heated midday of very late summer. Very well. So, he knew that the child came in through the garden gate at the back. Without much thought, without much more than a need to move, a need to do something, Porthos walked impatiently down the garden path, past the kitchen garden with its parched-looking rows of herbs, and down, past an area where trees shaded the path, to the unpainted, rickety gate at the back that had been barely visible from the practice room's door. He opened the gate, satisfied at its shriek, and looked out at the broad plaza back there. Back here, truly, you wouldn't know you were in Paris. This garden gate opened to a bucolic landscape, the back of several houses, narrow alleys running between the tall walls that encircle gardens. There was a vague scent of roses in the air, and Porthos remembered that Guillaume had come in yesterday with a rose in his cap, a bright red rose with widespread petals, of the sort that often grew along the lanes of Porthos' native village. Guillaume had said they were flowering just up the lane from here. Like a dog on the trail, Porthos followed the strong scent of roses across the plaza. Peering down a lane, he saw a straggle of nearly wild roses pushing over the top of a rickety stone wall. The roses were exactly the same color and look as the one Guillaume had worn. Convinced he at least knew the boy had come this way, Porthos trotted down the narrow alley. It was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and it was hemmed in by two very long, very high walls, both of which, from the noise and talks emerging from beyond them, probably hid to communal gardens shared by several rental houses or houses filled with rental rooms. At the end of the alley, another alley ran across it, forming as if the top of a T. Porthos frowned. Right or left? If he went right, and the boy was coming in, late, from the left, he would miss him completely. And then Guillaume would wonder where Porthos had gone. What had Guillaume said about his route here? What that might give Porthos a clue as to where the boy came from. Vaguely, because he hadn't been paying much attention, Porthos remembered that Guillaume had complained of the heat of a smithy he passed on the way here. It had been a couple of weeks ago, when August was at its hottest, the sun beating Paris to a red heat, as though it had been metal laying on Vulcan's own forge. And now, straining his ears, Porthos could hear as if hammers on metal. From the right. He hastened down the right side of the alley, till he came to a busy forge. It took up the bottom space of a tall house, but it had at least 3 doors, all of them open to the day. There were anvils with sweating men pounding on them, and there were boys working frantically at the bellows, and there was a nobleman from the attire in a corner, holding a nervous white horse who was being showed by 2 muscular young men. Porthos bit at the corner of his mustache. So there was a forge. Pray heaven it was the right one. Now from here, something about a fishmonger's. Just down the street. Porthos' nose led again, till he came to a fishmonger's in a huge plaza. From there so many roads led on that Porthos found himself quite at a loss. Until he remembered Guillaume admiring Porthos' new boots and saying that he'd seen some at the cobbler's on the way here, but that his father would never give him money for them. Peering down the streets, Porthos found the cobbler's. From there, he remembered the boy making some mention of a tavern at the end of an alley, and how musketeers sometimes drank there. The boy hadn't wanted to discuss the tavern much, but he told Porthos it was the Hangman. From Porthos' foggy memories of being led by Athos to every tavern in Paris, when Athos was in one of his drinking moods, Porthos found the alley that led to the back of the Hangman. He walked down half the alley before he saw the boy. At first, he thought it was just a pile of clothes, though the clothes were purple velvet, and the hat had a plume uncommonly like Guillaume's. It was crumpled against a wall, on the muddy ground of the alley at the back of the tavern. But when Porthos approached, his big feet raising dull echoes from the packed dirt, the bundle near the wall stirred, the hat went up, and a flushed, haggard face with bulging blue eyes stared at Porthos. Guillaume, Porthos said. What is wrong, boy? The boy looked at Porthos. His eyes were wide and shiny, but didn't seem to see him. The angels, he said. The angels flying. He was very red. Oh, here, boy. How much did you drink? Porthos asked, feeling annoyed with Guillaume and with himself. It was clear the boy had got hold of wine somewhere. Clumsily, Porthos reached for the boy and tried to make him stand, but he only flopped around like an ill-stuffed rag doll. Guillaume's arms moved outward. Flying, he said. And here, Porthos was momentarily confused. The boy was flushed, and he acted drunk, but there was no smell of alcohol about him. Could he have gone mad? Or was he ill? Here, Porthos said, trying to support the boy as he would one of his comrades when wounded or drunk. But the boy twisted and convulsed. Thirsty, he said. Very thirsty. Porthos, despairing of holding him firm, finally lifted him up and threw him over his shoulder. He would take Guillaume back to his lodgings, then call on Aramis. Aramis knew nearly anything and everyone. If the boy was sick, Aramis was the best person to find the boy's family. Sick or mad, they would need to know. Porthos hurried back towards his lodging at a semi-run. The boy, thrown over his shoulder, talked constantly, but not of anything that Porthos could see. Beautiful, he'd say. Angels. Flying. Flying. Birds. The sky is so blue. These words, as they walked through narrow, darkened alleys, made the hair at the back of Porthos' neck stand up. It was as if the boy were talking of some reality only he could see. Suddenly he stopped and convulsed, then again. There was a sound like a startled sigh. It didn't surprise Porthos when he put the boy down on the floor of the practice room to find the boy had died. Still he checked it, with a finger laid against the boy's neck, a hand searching for a heartbeat that wasn't there. At long last, he stood and slowly removed his hat in respect for the small corpse with his wide-open eyes, his expression of surprise. Guillaume Jaucourt was dead. Who knew from what? Who knew how to contact his family? Who could break the news to them? And if murder had been done, who could ensure the killer was found? Athos, Aramis, D'Artagnan. The names of his friends, the other three of what all call the four inseparables, came unbidden to Porthos' mind. He never doubted it. Slamming the hat back down on his head, he left the practice room, closing the door gently behind him. Athos, noble as Scipio and twice as wise, Aramis, learned in theology and the labyrinthine ways of Parisian society, D'Artagnan the young cunning Gascon. Those three would know how to help Porthos seek justice for his apprentice. Up and down the staircase, alarm and peril, the demands of friendship, the two men looked as different as two men could look. Early morning, on the marble staircase that led from the antechamber of Monsieur de Treville's antechamber to his private office, they fought a mock duel for the right to ascend the staircase. Defending it, on the higher step, was a dark-haired, pale-skinned man. His features would have made a classical sculptor weep, and his zeal-burned dark blue eyes could have graced a mystic or a saint. But he stood, sword in hand, with the adept grace of the veteran duelist. His tight-laced Spanish-cut doublet and knee breeches, now more than a decade out of fashion, lent him a timeless air, and also the air of one who would have control over his own body. His name was Athos, and had been Athos ever since he joined the Musketeers to hide who knew what shame or disgrace. Throughout Paris it was rumored that he came from the highest nobility, and that his crime was such that, if named, it would cause the heavens to shudder. The rumors were almost right. Before assuming the Musketeers' uniform as other men take the penitent's cowl, the man had been Alexander, Count de la Fere, descended from one of the oldest and most honored noble houses in the kingdom. And the sin for which he sought to atone was the execution of his countess for what had then seemed to him sufficient reason, but which seemed more monstrous with each passing year, and more unjustified with each new rigor of his chosen penance. Facing him, on the step below, was a man in his mid-twenties. With his long blonde hair, his soft, supple clothes that dripped with lace and screened with edging, and which gave him the appearance of a dandy, he might look soft and effeminate. No one who saw him would retain the illusion long, and certainly not after seeing the feline leaps, the graceful falls, the seemingly careless lunges of his sword play. He called himself Aramis, and said he was merely sojourning in the Musketeers till he considered himself worthy of joining a monastical order. Indeed, only some years ago, as the young and naive René Chevalier d'Herblay, he'd been a seminarian in Paris, intent on taking the orders for which his pious mother had destined him from birth. But d'Herblay's weakness was women. And unfortunately women showed the same propensity towards him. Which was why he'd been found reading the lives of saints to a lady of slightly less pure reputation than her family would wish. In the resulting duel he killed the lady's brother. Because dueling was illegal, ever since then he'd been hiding in the Musketeers, under the name of Aramis. Now he climbed the stair, pressing his friend close, his thrusts so carefully aimed that they did no more than slit the fabric of Athos' doublet. "You really must learn to cover your right," he told Athos with a smile that might pass as a smirk. Athos frowned. Aramis smirked more widely. There was an excitement in taunting Athos. Aramis had known his friend long enough and seen him in close enough situations that he realized inside Athos there was as if a wild beast, looking out and snarling in fury, and held in check only by Athos' intellect and Athos' conscience. There was the feeling that at any moment the control might slip loose, and the beast escape the confinement of the well-trained nobleman. But not now, and not over a game. Instead, Athos smiled back, one of his rare smiles, this one tinged with the amusement someone might feel towards an impertinent child. He charged down the stairs, pressing Aramis close, and making Aramis sweat in trying to parry all the thrusts. The rules of this game, as it was played by the corps of musketeers, the best sword fighters in the reign of His Majesty Louis XIII of France, were that the first to be pressed all the way up the stairs to the landing in front of the door to the office of Monsieur de Treville, their captain, or the first one to be pushed all the way down the stairs and off the steps altogether would lose the game. The loss usually involved many jokes from all their comrades, and, inevitably, a round of forfeited drinks stood by the loser, and a round of celebratory drinks by the winner. Aramis had no intention of losing. He'd lost the last 3 times he played this game with Athos, and the one he played it with Porthos. He'd not yet succeeded in challenging the cunning Gascon, D'Artagnan, to this pastime. The cunning newcomer to their group had a way of smiling and ignoring the best taunts and challenges from the rest of them. Unnerving when it had been so easy to challenge him to a duel on his first day in Paris. One must conclude either that the Gascon had grown prudent, something as unlikely as a fish growing wings, or that he valued his purse higher than his life. This last was quite likely, particularly as his purse, like that of the rest of them, was so often empty. Aramis's was not exactly brimming with coin just now, and he knew while he might be able to forego paying drinks as a winner by pleading poverty, he could never forego paying the forfeited drinks to the winner, and any hangers-ons should he lose. And Athos could drink most men in Paris under the table, while showing no other sign of inebriation than a profound and growing melancholy. On this thought, Aramis found himself on the very last step of the stairs, defending himself ineptly with his sword held too close to his body, while Athos charged down the steps, his lips curled in that curious snarl look they got when he was near claiming victory. Seeing Athos like this always raised the question whether the musketeer would remember in time that this was a friendly game, and stop himself from spearing his friend through. Aramis was fairly sure he would, and yet he was not willing to lose the remaining content of his purse. Making use of his agility, which was his greatest asset in any duel, he made as if to leap down, then ducked under Athos' sword arm and came at him from the other side, pushing Athos' sword out of the way with his doublet-padded forearm, and physically forcing his friend to take 3 steps up hastily. This gave Aramis room enough to lope upwards 2 steps and re-engage Athos in sword play. From beneath came the sound of shouted encouragements. "There's life in Aramis yet. And for a priest, he doesn't fight badly." And, of course, he is right, Athos does leave his right shoulder shamefully uncovered. All of it followed by the clink of coins that indicated that bets were being made and paid by the mass of musketeers down there, in the waiting room. Aramis tried to ignore them, as he concentrated on pushing Athos up yet another couple of steps, an intention that Athos resisted with his not inconsiderable skill at parrying. In a way, these mock duels were harder than the real duels, where Aramis could simply have tried to thrust his sword through his opponent's heart. But he would never injure Athos, or not voluntarily. Together, Athos, Aramis, Porthos and even the newcomer, D'Artagnan, had dueled and bled. Their friendship had been cemented by 100 instances of mutual defense, 1,000 shared secrets. They could no more kill each other than they could commit suicide. One would feel much like the other at any rate. And not killing Athos while forcing him up the steps was harder than it would have been to kill just about anyone. After all, they'd practiced and fought together so long, each knew the other very well, and every move could be anticipated. It was easiest of all to fight each other to a standstill. To get through, Aramis must block every thought and every move that didn't have anything to do with sword and footwork, and the unyielding body in front of him. He must forget it was Athos. Only remember, he must not kill him. He must, with swords clashing, in the sound of metal, and, with their swords gripped between them and held upright, with too little room to move, Aramis pressed forward with his body, forcing Athos up 1 step, 2, another. Very quickly. And then Athos recovered his balance. And on that balance came the ineluctable fact that Athos weighed more than Aramis. His rather solid mass of muscle and bone still looked lean enough, but was by far more hefty than Aramis's gracile figure. Once Athos had firmly planted his feet, Aramis could not budge him. Athos, speaking through his teeth, said, "Will you claim forfeit, Aramis?" From his voice, it was hard to tell whether it was a taunt, or whether he truly meant for Aramis to forfeit the game and concede defeat, even though the younger musketeer was nowhere near losing. From Athos' mad and dark blue eyes, too, it was hard to tell if he even remembered what humor was. "Sangre, Athos," Aramis said. "Would I forfeit?" "Well," Athos said, "then I have no choice but to make sure you lose." And on that the larger musketeer gave his friend a shove. Aramis caught himself quickly, a foot behind to recover his balance, and no harm really done, and then from the door to the antechamber, a familiar voice calling, "Aramis." He turned, without even thinking. He turned, half ready to scold Porthos for interrupting him at his game, and then he saw Porthos. The huge redeed, whose ancestors, doubtless, had come to the coasts of France in long ships, was not dressed in the style in which he usually permitted himself to appear in public. That was the first thing strange about it all, because Porthos was vain as a peacock, and his normal attire in public was twice as bright as any bird's plumage. Aramis could not remember his friend ever having appeared in public in this attire of worn linen breeches and a tunic that looked like a beggar would disdain it. No, Aramis had seen Porthos in these clothes, but only in the practice room, in the privacy of Porthos' own lodgings. In the normal course of things, Porthos would much rather die than be seen in public in this shabby a display. But, worse, the face above the clothes looked like Porthos had already died. Pale and bloodless, with a greyish tinge to the lips, Porthos' skin made his eyes look unnaturally bright, his hair and beard a screaming scarlet stain. "Porthos," Aramis said. And thinking no more of his duel or his potential forfeiting of money to buy enough drinks to fill the seine or satisfy Athos, he jumped over the elaborate railing of the staircase and landed, sword still in hand, in a hastily cleared space in the hall below. Too late he realized he had probably forfeited the contest, and was not reassured by the sound of Athos landing on the mosaic floor behind him. Not reassured as far as losing the contest, at least, but reassured by Athos' support. He heard Athos sheath his sword and remembered to sheath his own. The crowd was parting between him and Porthos. Though they were all musketeers, battle-hardened and ready to defend themselves against many foes, few had the body to obstruct Porthos' progress. The sheer bulk of Porthos would clear the way, and few of them would stand in front of Athos or Aramis either. So as the crowd melted away and pressed out of their path, on either side of the room, Aramis and Athos met with Porthos. Porthos was silent, which in itself was strange, after demanding their attention so forcefully. He looked from one to the other of them, and then at the staircase and the railing over which Aramis had jumped. He frowned, as though trying to make sense of something particularly difficult. "Sorry I interrupted your game," he said. "The game matters not," Athos said. "We can finish another time." And, as Aramis let out breath relieved at not being held to forfeit, Porthos nodded. "It's very important, see. He's dead." "Who is dead, who?" Aramis asked, his impatience tempered by concern. He would easily have been the first to admit that his friend was inarticulate, and had a difficult time expressing himself. But today Porthos seemed inarticulate even for himself, as if he were in shock. And why would Porthos be in shock at someone's death? Death was their profession and their companion, walking by their side night and day. "Who is dead? Who?" he asked in alarm and, lowering his voice, as the horrible thought occurred to him that he'd not seen the young Gascon since last night. "Not D'Artagnan." But Porthos' eyes widened in surprise, as if D'Artagnan's death had never occurred to him, and then he shook his huge leonine head. "No, not him. The boy. My apprentice." Apprentice. Frowning, unable to understand of what Porthos spoke, Aramis realized that other musketeers were listening in on their conversation, and that a hushed silence had fallen in the room. Before he could think what this meant, he heard a well-known voice yell, from upstairs, the entrance to the captain's office, "Athos, Porthos, Aramis." Aramis turned to see a musketeer who had been in conference with the captain skulk down the stairs. At the top of the stairs Monsieur de Tréville stood, glaring down at them. Though he was as olive-skinned and as short as their friend D'Artagnan, who came up barely to Aramis's shoulder and no more than to Porthos' chest, there was not a man in the room that wouldn't swear Monsieur de Tréville was at least 12 feet tall. And each and every one of them would have allowed himself to be cheerfully cut into ribbons for the captain. Which was why Aramis's breath caught in his throat as the captain said, "If the three of you, gentlemen, would come into my office, I'd like to be a part of your conference." Without a word, Aramis turned to obey, and found that Athos was already ahead of him, running up the stairs. But he had to reach for Porthos' arm and pull before the giant musketeer realized he must obey. That he hadn't jumped to the captain's order meant something was very wrong indeed. Monsieur de Tréville's displeasure, secrets kept, where plots and treason lurk in every corner. Am I to understand, Monsieur de Tréville asked, frowning, and rounding on Athos, as he entered the office, that your young friend, D'Artagnan, got himself killed? Athos whipped his plumed hat from his head and inclined slightly. In the anteroom he never bothered to remove his headgear, but here, and in the presence of his superior, he had to. "I don't believe so, Monsieur de Tréville." At least Porthos said no. "Didn't you, Porthos?" He looked sideways towards his red-headed friend, to see him standing there, beside Aramis, his mouth half open, and a look of confused thought on his broad features, for all the world, as though Athos had just asked him an insoluble question. Aramis, who could be as impatient as any of them with Porthos' slowness, looked shocked at Porthos' silence. He reached out and shook Porthos' arm. "Porthos," he said, "it is not D'Artagnan who is dead, is it?" "What?" Porthos said, as though waking. He looked at the captain as though noticing him for the first time, and, whipping his hat from his head, fanned himself with it. "No, it's not D'Artagnan." He looked around, and homed in on one of the three armchairs that faced a broad desk. He dropped into one of them, and only then seemed to notice the surprised look on the face of the captain, who remained standing. "I beg your pardon, Monsieur de Tréville," he said then. "It's been a hell of a shock." For a moment it all hung in the balance. Athos' memory extended back over the years when they'd all gotten excoriated in this office for small offenses and big, ranging from having allowed themselves to be defeated in a duel by guards of the cardinal, to the recent and horrible time when Monsieur de Tréville had been convinced that Aramis had murdered his mistress. For an offense like Porthos of sitting down in the captain's office without the captain's permission, it could go either way. The captain could laugh it off, or he could yell at the musketeer in terms that would peel the skin of an elephant. The shrewd dark eyes of the captain narrowed as his gaze swept over Porthos. And perhaps because he noticed the musketeer's unusual pallor, his look of stunned shock, Monsieur de Treville sighed and shrugged. "Who is dead, Porthos?" he said. "And why do you announce it in my antechamber, thus starting the gossip flowing?" As he spoke, he walked around his own desk, and sat down in his own chair. He waved to Aramis and Athos. "You may sit down as well, gentlemen," since Monsieur Porthos took the initiative. Again there was the little surprised motion, as if Porthos hadn't fully woken till then. "I'm sorry," he said. "Shouldn't I have sat down?" "What, no," Monsieur de Treville said firmly. "Never mind that. Only tell us who is dead." "My apprentice," Porthos said. "The boy." "What boy?" Aramis caught him impatiently, mirroring the impatience that Athos himself was starting to feel. "We did not have the pleasure of knowing that you had an apprentice." Porthos shrugged. "I did not see any reason to tell you since it didn't involve you." Athos waited for Porthos to go on, and when nothing issued from Porthos' lips, he prompted. "Well, will you tell us now?" "I believe I must," Porthos said. He sighed. "Since otherwise I might never know who murdered the boy." "Oh, so it is murder you've alarmed my antechamber with," Monsieur de Treville said, his voice just caught between amusement and impatience. This Athos could understand, since Porthos often caused both feelings in him. The gigantic musketeer from Normandy was not, at the best of times, a master of rhetoric. In fact, many of the men who assembled in the antechamber right now took him for a simpleton, and marveled that such men as Athos and Aramis associated with him. And most of them attributed their friendship to charity. But the truth was that Athos, who despaired of heaven on that day when he'd left his wife swinging by the neck from a low branch in his domain of La Fere, and abandoned both title and lands to come to Paris and become a musketeer, had very little interest in charity, and very little interest in those who were his intellectual inferiors. He knew that in Porthos' huge head, beneath the wealth of red hair, worked a brain at least as fast as his own, and probably faster. Time and again, in difficult situations, it had been Porthos who had cut through the fog of confusion and theories to see the plain truth, a gift far rarer than seeing the complex truth. It was just that Porthos, who had once been a dance master, who was unequaled with sword, and whose thought could follow complex puzzles, found his way to words difficult and barred, as though his words must reach the world, one at a time through a small slit in a thick wall. Now, having declared that he must tell them about his apprentice, he ground again into silence. His huge fingers played with the gold braid on the edge of his hat, and he looked attentively down at them, as though hypnotized by their movement. "Porthos, you must speak," Athos said, commanding his voice to gentleness. His life had schooled him little in such. His father had demanded much of him, from manliness to courage, but never tenderness and never charity to those weaker than himself. He'd been inclined to it at any rate, as a young man who read much and thought more. But he'd had to leave tenderness and finer feeling behind after his wife Charlotte's death. After Charlotte's murder. "Porthos," he said, again a little louder, as Porthos turned to look at him. "You must tell us who your apprentice is and why he's dead and why you're here." Porthos shook his head as though to clear it. "He was Guillaume Jucourt," he said. "And he came to me to learn sword fighting. And he died just a little while ago. He's in my practice room. I'm not sure he was murdered, of course. I think he was poisoned." "He came to you to learn sword fighting?" Aramis asked. "In the name of all that's holy, why would anyone come to you for sword-fighting lessons?" Porthos looked wounded, then shrugged. "You did. Once. You were a sword master then." "It is different," Aramis said. And Monsieur de Treville's voice cut in, cold and sensible, and holding only the slightest inch of that amusement that Porthos caused in most people when they weren't exasperated at him. "Did he know who you were, Porthos? Or suspect?" Porthos shrugged, then nodded. "He came to me," he said. "And tried to blackmail me into teaching him," he said. He was the huge hand was held up at about his shoulder height while sitting. This all. And a stripling with barely as much width to his whole trunk as one of my legs. Red-heated. Freckled. With pimples starting. And he told me I had to help him learn to fight with a sword, or he would tell the world my secret. "And you taught him?" Athos asked. Porthos looked up. Suddenly he smiled. For the first time since he'd come in looking dismal and cold and lost, he looked like himself. "Not because of the blackmail," he said. "Look, he was a child. Barely 12. And all of us when we were children, we were subjected to our parents' whims. My father didn't want me to learn to read, and Aramis's mother didn't want him to learn to fight." And Athos he stopped. Their eyes met and Porthos' smile died entirely away, and he shrugged. Athos wondered what he'd been about to say. Porthos and Athos had never, that he knew, discussed Athos' upbringing. In fact, of all of them, he was the one who'd ever been least inclined to speak of his upbringing and background. They might know of the crime that had sent him into the Musketeers, to flee his conscience more than anything else. But of the time before that, they knew nothing. Athos was not curious enough to ask. Porthos had an inconvenient habit of knowing the truth. He looked away from Porthos and at Monsieur de Treville sitting judge-like behind his desk. "Well, I felt that sometimes parents don't know what's best for their child," Porthos said. His voice had lost some of its force but regained it as he went on. "And Guillaume's parents might not want him to learn to fight, and they might intend him for the church, but some of our best fighters have been men in orders, and some of our best religious men have been fierce swordsmen." "Indeed," Aramis said, not without irony. His Eminence Cardinal Richelieu, himself. It was like Porthos not to take this for a challenge, but to accept it as a comment, Athos thought. Because Richelieu had indeed been a fierce duelist in his youth. Porthos clearly saw nothing wrong with the mention of him. Like him, he said. "So I thought, what harm does it do to teach Guillaume a little sword play, if he can get away from his parents to learn? What ill does it do? Who cares? His parents perhaps," Aramis said, his voice cutting cold. "Well, perhaps," Porthos said, and shrugged. "But I figured soon enough and somehow that boy would be out on his own recognizance, and he would do as he pleased. And if he was that desperate to learn that he went through the trouble of finding out who I was, and of coming to me," he spread his hands across the top of his hat. "I thought the least I could do is teach him." "And did his family find out?" Athos asked sharply. "Are you sure he died by poison and not from a beating?" "Some parents," Porthos shook his head. "No marks on him. Almost for sure poison, unless someone hit him on the head. He was talking about angels and flying." Aramis, facing Athos over Porthos' inclined head, quirked an eyebrow. Athos shrugged. "It could be anything. The boy's father might have found out and punished him severely. But why should he? Wouldn't it have been easier for the parents to prevent the boy from coming to lessons?" he said. "Exactly," said Monsieur de Treville. He brought his hands up, with his wrists resting on the polished desk, and touched the tips of his fingers together. "Exactly what I was thinking, Athos. I was also thinking that no matter how determined to devote the child to the church, few parents would view this delinquency as little more than a show of spirit. And if they were determined to send him to the church," Aramis said, "they were more likely to punish him by making him repeat maxims of the Testament or study his theology." Somehow he managed an audible shudder in his disciplined, well-bred voice. Porthos raised his eyebrows but said nothing. "Exactly," Monsieur de Treville said again, and then, looking straight at Porthos. "Jaucourt, you said. Not a name known to me. A noble family, you think?" He referred to his father as the gentleman Jaucourt, Porthos said. "I've never heard of them," Monsieur de Treville said. "Of course there are many families come from provincial domains in search of fortune or royal favor in Paris, whose names wouldn't be known to me. But usually, if a family is at court, some rumor of their presence, some reference to one of their retainers, reaches my ears." He wiggled his fingers against each other and seemed immersed in black thoughts. "Did he ever tell you how he found out your true identity, Porthos?" "Sir?" Porthos asked, puzzled. "If he was truly 12, Monsieur de Treville said. Or thereabouts, surely he can't have done a great deal of searching out the truth on his own. How would he come by it?" Porthos shrugged. People know it, Captain. I lived in Paris before I joined the Musketeers." He opened his hands as if to signal the obvious. "And I'm not exactly one of those people who pass unnoticed in a crowd." Monsieur de Treville nodded, but his long, thin-fingered hand stroked at his well-trimmed beard. "Doubtless," he said, and smiled a little as if to acknowledge that the thought of Porthos passing unnoticed in any crowd was ridiculous. "But it's been many years, Porthos, and how would the boy know?" Porthos shrugged again. "Perhaps his father knew. From a noble family so newly arrived to Paris that we've never heard of their name." "Unlikely, my friend," the captain said. But then Athos said, "What do you think is behind all this?" As for himself, he couldn't any more have articulated a coherent theory than he could have hazarded a reasonable-sounding guess, but something was working at the back of his mind, something that made the hair stand on end in the nape of his neck. Monsieur de Treville shook his head. "I hesitate to say it," he said. "Since it is possible I am wrong and just of habit, attributing the worst of villainy to a foe. But the cardinal bears you some ill will, has borne all of you some ill will for a long time, for being the fiercest fighters in His Majesty's Musketeers. And since these past two recent incidents in which you foiled his plans, one," Monsieur de Treville drummed his fingers on the desktop, "well, his animosity for you knows no bounds. I would say, Porthos my friend, it is quite likely the boy was sent to you and told who you were. That his death owes something to the cardinal." and that things are said to accuse you of murder in an attempt to defend yourself from blackmail. What? The captain stopped. Porthos was shaking his head violently. No, he said. Guillaume was sincere and sincerely seeking instruction in sword fighting. The captain shrugged. Perhaps. I did not say he wasn't. Only that the cardinal was behind sending him to you and that the cardinal is behind his death. Or might be. Just because Cardinal Richelieu is the greatest power in France, more powerful even than the king, it doesn't follow that every plot and every evil should be laid at his door. However, a lot of them can, and it also doesn't follow he wasn't behind this one. And Athos said, feeling his uneasiness answered by the captain's theory. The truth is that it would be all too easy for him to find a young boy of small nobility, dissatisfied with his lot in life, and to arm him with the means to approach you. It would be no more unlikely than his finding an orphan and putting her in a position to impersonate the queen, all without the poor young woman knowing she was being used at all. Too, it could have happened that way, Porthos. But a child? Porthos asked. If the cardinal thought it fit his views of what is good for France, I think he'd willingly kill a newborn dauphin in his swaddling clothes. Porthos looked at Athos intently, his eyes focusing seemingly with all his will. If the cardinal has anything to do with Guillaume's death, he shall be called out, cardinal or not. The captain looked alarmed. He came out from behind his desk and put his hand on Porthos' shoulder. Porthos, my friend. The important thing right now is for you, all four of you, including your friend D'Artagnan, who was privy to the other crime investigations, to find out who the boy truly was, how he died, and if there's a culprit. If it turns out to be the cardinal, I shall take it upon myself to seek vengeance. I shall present proof to His Majesty himself. Meanwhile, I would say you must hide this crime. And you must promise me that you'll do nothing rash. Captain Porthos said, sounding bullish. Promise me, Porthos. Haven't I saved your life on more than one occasion? Monsieur de Treville, you have, but then promise me. There was a long silence. Athos could almost imagine the cogs turning inside his friend's head as he weighed the best course of action. At last Porthos sighed heavily. I promise. I promise I shall do nothing until I know. If the cardinal is guilty, though, I will demand my revenge. Then we shall talk again, Monsieur de Treville said. Meanwhile, I would send for your Gascon friend and start your inquiry. If you like this content and want to support this channel, the blog, and Sarah's continued writing, please like and subscribe. If you really enjoy the content, please come and join the fun at accordingtohit.com.